guys have shared PCAPs of malicious or suspicious traffic with anybody? See a few hands. I came about doing this because while I was working at Rackspace, I had run across some interesting activity I wanted to share, but you start realizing that MAC addresses, IP addresses, and maybe some other stuff that you're not fully aware of is happening that could give away characteristics of the network. And so I had to figure out, as the months went by, a good way of sharing information. And now that I share information on the malware traffic analysis.net site, I routinely sanitize my PCAPs so as to not give away any of the characteristics of the network that I am generating the infection traffic on. So I currently work for Palo Alto Networks Unit 42. For about 4 years I was working at Rackspace, and before then I was a contract worker for the US government working at the Air Force CERT. And this is after a career in the military doing intelligence work, something I can't really discuss. But if it wasn't for Palo Alto Networks, I don't know that I'd still be doing the blog and sharing this information. But it's become a compulsion for me. If I don't go a normal weekday without generating some sort of traffic and sharing it through the blog, it just feels a little wrong at this point. I've been doing it for so long. I think I started it in 2013. And fortunately, with Palo Alto Networks, working for Unit 42, under Palo Alto Networks, I'm able to integrate the blog into a larger body of work for the company. So in order to share a PCAP with other people and not give away characteristics of my test environment, I need to do a few things. First, I'll need to carve any unnecessary data in that PCAP. I'll need to carve it out of Wireshark, save that PCAP, and then use a hex editor to change MAC addresses, change IP addresses, and change other info that may give away characteristics of my network. And then use TCPREWRITE to fix any of the checksum errors that I'll get after editing the PCAP in a hex editor. So when I'm carving a PCAP, there are two issues to consider. And one is that I never share data using the PCAP NG format. And of course, I'll have to filter in Wireshark to remove any data that's not relevant to the particular infection traffic or suspicious activity that I happen to be recording. So the PCAP NG format, the thing I don't like about it is it shows information on the host that is captured, that is capturing the network traffic. So for example, if you're recording in Wireshark, if you're using Wireshark to record, it's going to by default record in the PCAP NG format. So when you look at that PCAP, it's going to tell you what hardware you recorded it on, what your processor is, what your operating system is, what version of Wireshark you're using, and it's going to give details of the interface. You know, what is the MAC address that it's recording on, and some other information that you wouldn't want to get out there. Now TCPREWRITE, when I use that for any PCAP NG files I generate, TCPREWRITE will convert it to a regular PCAP format, and it will strip all the PCAP NG information out of it. But so I'll never share a PCAP in the PCAP NG format just because of this particular issue. But if I have a PCAP and I've got an infection, and let's say, for example, I'm recording on my Windows client that I'm infecting is at 10.1.1.191. And I know this particular piece of malware is just generating web-based callback traffic. So that means anything else that's in this PCAP that could indicate characteristics of my internal network, I'm going to get rid of. So any NBNS traffic, any SMB traffic, anything unique to Windows that's not related to the infection, I'm going to filter out. So this is kind of a common filter that I'll use to filter out a lot of stuff. This is the baseline. Right? I'm not going to use IPv6 traffic or ICMP, IGMP, anything that's UDP and not DNS. I'm going to filter out using this particular filter. Now, I'm going to check it first before I filter it out. because there could be ICMP tunneling. For example, I can't remember the last time I've seen legitimate commodity malware use ICMP tunneling, but it's out there. I have run across it before, and I'm sure I may run across it again. I don't want to be surprised. I don't want to just automatically get this stuff out there, but there are certain types of malware that'll be generating traffic on, Emotet being one of them, where I know it acts a certain way. So a cursory check on this stuff just to make sure that Emotet hasn't developed any new techniques. I'm going to filter all this stuff out. And then I'm going to filter out unnecessary, unrelated DNS requests, like the DNS requests you'll see for Teredo or WPAD or ISATAP or any of that other crap. So once I have my initial capture, and I am, I've filtered out anything I don't want, I'm going to export the specified packets that I have left according to my Wireshark display filter. Once I export that, I'm going to use the hex editor to change the information inside the PCAP. Now you could use a tool like Trace Wrangler. Is anybody familiar with Trace Wrangler at all? I met the guy that authors Trace Wrangler at the Shark Fest, the annual Wireshark conference. And he's a good guy, and he does this, but he does it from definitely a non-security centric point of view. And it's a Windows-specific tool, which is, I've tried it, and it's like, it's a different way of thinking. And so I don't use Trace Wrangler, but I always like to bring it up as an alternative to sanitizing PCAPs, because it will do it if you get used to the way of thinking that goes into sanitizing a PCAP through Trace Wrangler. So if you're curious, give it a try. For hex editors, I generally tend to work out of a Linux distro or my MacBook. And if I'm going straight off the MacBook, I'll generally use HexFiend. I've played around with some other hex editors, and HexFiend is the one that generally works best for me. Bless for Debian-based distros on Linux. Is there for Red Hat-based distro, CentOS, is there a decent hex editor? Because I haven't found one. A GUI-based hex editor like Bless. But Bless is really, I can't say enough good things about it as far as working in Linux and using that as a hex editor. And if I'm, for any reason, stuck on Windows, I'll use HXD in general. That's my go-to. So with the hex editor, I'm going to change the MAC address. That'll be the first thing that I'll change in my PCAP before sharing it. So in any case, you're going to have at least one client. You're going to have that routing point. All right. So you're filtering on HTTP or HTTPS traffic, and you've got that MAC address of that Windows client, and then you've got that MAC address as it leaves your internal network, that routing point. Right. So the client, the router, and then there are any other hosts. Because sometimes I'll share a PCAP where I've got a Active Directory environment where I have not only the client and the router, but I've got the Active Directory server that's acting as a DNS controller and possibly DHCP. Any of the MAC addresses that are involved, I'm going to switch them. For example, in this particular PCAP that I have right here, the source, the Windows client, is this MAC address. So I'm going to open up this PCAP file in this case, Bless, and I'm going to find and replace using hexadecimal. Right? And I'm basically going to put that MAC address in with another MAC address, replace it all and save it, and now I've got this MAC address for the infected Windows client, which is, if you look at my site when I'm sharing these PCAPs, this is my default Windows client MAC address. So if you see that, I'm not really using a Hewlett-Packard computer from 1997. I'm actually using something else, but that is just my default MAC address for an infected Windows client. I've got a default MAC address for whatever router gateway that the traffic is going out of. And I've got a default MAC address if I'm using a domain controller that I'll generally tend to use if I'm sharing stuff on the malwaretrafficanalysis.net site. So changing the IP address. That's another indication of your internal network that I would rather not share if I'm sharing a PCAP. So I will change it. So in this case, I'm also going to use a hex editor. And I'm going to change the client, the gateway IP, if the gateway IP shows up, the domain controller or whatever server your IP address is being used for DNS queries, the broadcast address, and any IP addresses that are used for DHCP. That could be the domain controller. That could be, for example, if you're in VMware and some other real environments, it's usually .254 that I'll run into a lot of times that is used as the IP address for DHCP traffic. So here's an example of a PCAP where I've got the Windows client at 192.168.1.209. The actual gateway IP is .1.1. The domain controller is at .1.4. The broadcast address is at .1.255, and then DHCP is at .1.254. I'm going to change those. Instead of 192.168, I'm going to make it 172.16. Now, one of the considerations that you'll need to understand when you're doing this stuff is I can change it to any internal Class A, Class B, Class C IP address. That's internal, non-routable. But what I'll want to do is I'll want to make it the same number of ASCII characters in case it comes up in text in some way, shape, or form. So I have the exact number of ASCII characters I'm replacing. Okay? You don't always have to do it, but if it comes up, if this information comes up in, for example, sometimes I'll see it in SMB traffic. And it will be in such a case where I can't change a 192.168 address into a 10 dot address because there wouldn't be enough characters. And then if you try and edit a PCAP and you shorten or lengthen the amount of characters, ASCII characters, the data in there, it will basically make it unusable when you save it. So when I'm using the hex editor, I'm using the hexadecimal replacement. So all of those 192.168 addresses, I'm changing to 172.16. And then there's other info. A lot of times you'll see an IP address checked by the infected host. Sometimes it'll be over HTTPS and you don't have to worry about it. But most of the time it's over just regular HTTP and it'll come back, boom, it's got that public IP address that your traffic is going out from. And I would rather that people don't know where I'm coming out of. Normally I'm using some sort of VPN solution or spinning up a server somewhere and doing open VPN through it just to make sure I'm not coming out of my home. If I'm at a hotel, half the time I'll just go through the hotel IP address just to see if they're blocking anything. And in this case, my hotel did not block a full-scale Emotet infection that I did yesterday morning before I came in. But I'm going to disguise that public IP address because I don't want people to know I was using that IP address used by whatever particular hotel chain that I was in. Callback data. Callback data. Sometimes when you get an information stealer, it will exfiltrate information about your host. Host names, Windows user account names, processor, memory, some interesting stuff that can be exfiltrated in post-infection traffic that you want to keep an eye on. In some cases, if that data is encoded or somehow encrypted, then I might not share it at all. Because if in some cases it's just encoded or encrypted in such a way that I may not realize how to decode or decrypt it, and then that's a long process. I'd have to decode it, change it, recode it, and hopefully it doesn't take any more space in the amount of ASCII characters or hexadecimal characters in there that would mess up the PCAP. So in some cases I do, in some cases I don't. In some cases I'll just spin up a physical or virtual host, from a new install just to avoid that problem. And then other information that may reveal your public location or internal network. Here's an example of Emotet where Emotet, when you first get infected, one of the things that it will do routinely is call out and get your public IP address. In this case, this is not the public IP address that I was using at that particular time. This has been edited. And what I did was I looked up, years ago, I looked up a Verizon Fios IP address. It was 173.66.46.112. And then I'll add ones or take away digits to match the length of characters used for an IP address that's reported by an IP address check. Well, this is just an example of Emotet from sometime last year. TrickBot's really interesting because TrickBot will send a large amount of data about your infected host, and it will send it over unencrypted HTTP traffic. And I don't know if you've looked at it, but it does send a lot of information. You can follow the TCP stream for that particular HTTP request when you're looking at the traffic in Wireshark. And it will show you a bunch of stuff. Now, in this case, let's get a little more visible here. Certain things I'm going to change, like the physical address. This is the MAC address, which I already changed by this point in the PCAP, through the hex data. But here is a form of it in ASCII data that I'm also going to have to change. I'm going to want to change the addresses, right? Maybe I'll want to change the interface description. And then there's plenty of other information that I end up changing there. There's host names. There's the amount of usable RAM that the system has active at the time. A lot of data. So if you see any TrickBot traffic that I'm sharing on the site, know that a lot of work goes into sanitizing that to make it seem like it's to disguise the actual setup of my internal environment. So all those changes are going to make checksum errors in your PCAP, something I didn't realize when I was first starting out. I think it was Will Metcalf from Emerging Threats was discussing with him, or possibly Doug Burks from Security Onion, one of the two guys I was talking with, chatting with, or email corresponding with, and they said that, well, just use TCPREWRITE, that'll fix all the checksum errors. I didn't realize that. So TCPREWRITE is part of the TCP Replay suite. So you can install it on a MacBook, you can install it on any Linux distro by just apt-get install TCP Replay, or yum install TCP Replay, or whatever. I forget how to do it on the Mac. I did it a long while ago. I think I had to use brew or something like that to put it on there. And then, but it is a Unix space. So if you're working specifically out of Windows for this type of work, which I would highly not recommend, you're not going to have this option. You're going to have to spin up a VM and use some sort of Linux distro to get access to TCP Replay. And I could very well be wrong in it. There could be a version available for Windows. I just don't like, what do they say, don't shit where you eat. I don't like to work in an environment that's the same environment I'm testing my malware in. So here's the command syntax, right? TCPREWRITE, you get your in file, which in the first case is an edited PCAP. The out file, we'll just call it X. And then I'm changing it. Normally when I'm filtering when I'm filtering out traffic, I'm going to leave that particular LAN segment, usually in a /24 LAN segment. So if I've edited it to where everything is 10.1.1.0/24, I'm going to just change that third octet. And then I'll change it back again to the original one. So I'm fixing all the checksum errors and putting the IP address space back to what it was originally before I fixed the checksum errors through TCPREWRITE. Does that make sense? And that's really it. This is, it was hard-won knowledge. Nobody ever really came out and told me, except for the TCPREWRITE information, nobody specifically told me, hey, you might want to, this is how you might want to check some of the information. And there's plenty of pitfalls. If you go back to my site and you look at PCAPS I shared in 2013 and early 2014, you'll see that it's obviously at the time VMware. And now I currently use a mix of VMware Fusion, the KVM if I'm going from a Linux distro, and I've tried VirtualBox. I don't really care for it that much, and physical hosts. I definitely have a good physical host setup because there's a lot of malware out there that definitely checks to see if it's in a virtualized environment. But that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask now, and I'll be available through the end of the conference. Yes, sir?
Have you tried using SCAPI to fix some checksums?
Have I tried using SCAPI to fix some checksums? No, I have not.
I've written something before that looked for obvious strings, for example, that would have a company name in it. Replace those with something of the same length to not corrupt the cap, and then delete all of the checksums with SCAPI as your checksum.
Ah, nice. So you're saying that a lot of what I've just said here, you could actually automate through SCAPI, which...
Use regular expressions in Python and just pull them out. And
okay. Well, let me talk with you afterwards, and I can make that information available the next time. I'm going to speak on this at Sansfire later in June. I would like to be able to add that as an option. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your contribution to the community. We've been reaping the benefits of all you're doing for years.
Thanks.
I also would like to ask, we have PAN firewalls, so a lot of the work you do, is it a safe assumption that your work flows back into the PAN firewalls? And second question is, autofocus, wildfire, I've been told that the PAN threat hunters know how to use those. Do you use those tools, or are those other folks in Palo Alto?
Okay, so the question is, since I'm an employee of Palo Alto Networks, that is my research based on information that I'm finding through the Palo Alto Networks ecosystem set of tools, and does the work that I do, does that get fed back into protective measures by Palo Alto Networks equipment? And for that second one, yes, it does. I've been talked to before when I first started out, because my method is to get information out there as quickly as possible. And so when I first started working for Palo Alto Networks, normally what I would do is, in one case I made the mistaken assumption that a particular piece of malware, a particular, I think it was a domain or a callback, that wasn't being blocked by the firewall at the time. And it came back to Palo Alto Networks, came back to my boss, came back to me. And he wasn't mean about it. It's like, hey, before you start posting stuff on your blog, just make sure that we have our protective measures in place. So that, by and large, I don't usually have to worry about that. But every once in a while, in this cat and mouse game, and I focus mainly on commodity malware, it is a cat and mouse game. It's a race to where any security vendor is adjusting their protective measures and their detections, and the bad guys are up in their game. So no matter who you are, there's always going to be some issue where the criminals may have a small, slight window of opportunity. So yes, I do now. Of course, I do. Anything that I post on the malwaretrafficanalysis.net blog is going to be checked against our systems. As far as the other Palo Alto Networks equipment, the ecosystem and some of the tools. Yes, I'll use wildfire. Yes, I'll use autofocus, some of the other stuff. But realistically, for Unit 42, we're giving back to the community. So, my particular research really isn't based on what I'm finding through the Palo Alto Network's tools. It's a lot of what I get, believe it or not, I'm getting tip-offs through Twitter, right? URL House, a free service. Who knows about URL House? Right? Show of hands. URL HAUS.ch. Check that out. That is very, very up to date. A community of like-minded security professionals like ourselves that are feeding data publicly. Okay? My personal mission statement is to shine a light on the bad guys, right? Whether I'm working for Palo Alto Networks or whoever I may be working for in the future, that's going to continue to be my personal mission, to get that stuff out there. My philosophy is shine a light on the bad guys, right? And other people, and it's a philosophical argument, because you shine the light on the bad guys, they're just going to change. And if they change, then you've got to do a lot more work to shine that light on the bad guys. So, so there's a healthy mix of different perspectives on this stuff, but mine certainly is, and the people that I follow on Twitter and that I'm very friendly with in the community are ones who hold a like-minded position. And I'll be happy to debate that issue with any of you guys, over a beer or drink of your choice, whenever. I'm always happy to talk about that. Yes, sir.
TCPREWRITE, it doesn't like non-Ethernet encapsulated traffic. And it will parse heavily if you're capturing through something like localhost or whatever. If it's not an Ethernet frame type, it doesn't work. And you can compile it on Windows if you're in a single environment, but not that you want to do that.
Gotcha. You are correct. You are correct, sir. So the statement is that TCPREWRITE does not like non-Ethernet style packets, and that is correct. And I'm normally, God forbid, normally I'm living in the IP and the application layer, right? And it even took me a while, to properly automatically in my mind separate the frames from the packets from the segments and what levels that they're living on. But yeah, I'm not, normally I'll get rid of anything that's not, when I'm filtering on a particular IP address. So I shouldn't see any non-IP based frames, and there shouldn't be anything below the frame level on that.
It's only when you're capturing on the localhost interface
on
Linux, not that you would be hopefully collecting any samples from localhost.
Right.
Network captures, but it's something to keep an eye out for. Replay hasn't been
Gotcha.
very well maintained, but that's another step that you need to pre-process before you process.
Thank you. So yeah, when I started out doing it, I actually did record on the local host. I just set up Wireshark on the local host. This is way back when, 2013. I don't do that anymore. No, but yeah, if you're recording a packet on the local host, you could have some non-Ethernet issues that would really mess up, as the gentleman was saying, with TCPREWRITE. However, normally, and that's really time for a different discussion on how I have my lab set up, where I'm definitely recording outside of the environment in promiscuous mode whenever possible. Any other questions?
I need to cut you off, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.